monument up at Mount Soledad. So there's definitely a Navy tradition. Granddad was World War I Navy. Other granddad was a signalman World War II, submarine sailor. But I did have an uncle who was an Air Force guy. So Navy, if you lived here in the 60s, as a kid, you would not even think about going to the Navy. Coast Guard you couldn't get into if you were drowning, you couldn't get into the Coast Guard. Marines, you get shot at in the Marines, so that was off my list. And then there was the Army, you get shot at in the Army too. So, well, I think I'll try this Air Force thing. So I went to, recruiter took the test with a 4-part scoring, and depending on how you scored, it guaranteed you one of 4 classifications. I picked electronics just because I did, and off I went to Lackland Air Force Base in 1968. Living in the good old World War II wood barracks that some of you probably lived in, that were all over the world, and still are all over the world. 6 weeks of basic training. And they said, okay, you're going to be a missile electronics guy. And I said, wow, that's cool. And no bullets, with rockets and stuff. This is going to be a good deal. So off I went to Lowry Air Force Base in Aurora, Colorado for missile school. When I arrived there, they said, okay, you're going to be a telemetry guy. Ooh, this is satellites and big rockets and no bullets. This is a really cool idea. My school was 40 weeks. There were 6 people a month in the school was all. And we lived in the same crappy wood barracks as we lived in Texas, except ours actually had inside walls, which the ones in Texas didn't. And ours had coal-burning furnaces still in 1968. Got orders when I was done for the Air Force Flight Test Center, is what they actually said. They didn't say Edwards Air Force Base, it said Air Force Flight Test Center. And I'll be totally honest, I had no idea what the hell Edwards was, where it was. I didn't know. And I'm going, well, it's kind of cool. They must have big rockets at Edwards. And I looked up where it was, and it was out in the middle of the Gallaudet Mojave Desert. And I said, that's kind of odd. So off I went. I went up Highway 58, and I arrived on a Monday of a 3-day weekend. Turned off of Highway 58 onto the base, or what said it was the base, and there was a big sign there, welcome to Edwards Air Force Base. And there was nobody, and I had my newly printed orders, and I'm looking for the air policeman to tell me where to go. And I drove, and I drove, and I didn't find one, and I drove some more, there was no gate, and I drove some more, and there was no guardhouse. And finally, I'm in the middle of the base, and there's a bunch of buildings, and there is not a soul. It is nobody. Finally found an air policeman, and he said, oh, you can go over here to this building up here, you got a mile up this way, another mile up that way, and you'll find it. What I discovered was I was actually assigned to Air Force Flight Test Center, which is a tenet of Edwards Air Force Base. Edwards was called the Muroc Army Airfield when it was first acquired. The reason there were no gates is a lady that owned all the property had put in the purchase contract that they couldn't put gates because she wanted her and her friends to be able to take a shortcut across the base when they wanted to go to Barstow from Lancaster. So there could be no gates. The base was later named for Captain Edwards, who our General Cardenas, who just passed away, knew very well because Captain Edwards was flying a B-49 bomber. Airplane did a backflip and crashed into the middle of the desert in Edwards. And they renamed the base for him. General Cardenas would tell you without question how horrible the B-49 was, and how he told them not to do this maneuver, but while he was in Washington, D.C., they decided to do it anyway. So here's what's at Edwards? But Edwards is the Air Force Flight Test Center, NASA Armstrong Flight Research Center, which used to be called Brighton. Air Force Test Pilot School. And there's rockets there. And I went, cool, there's rockets here, because the Rocket Research Laboratory is there, where they do testing on rocket engines. The range support, there's LNS band telemetry. There's a high range, which is a bunch of microwave sites that go to Vandenberg one direction, they go to Ely, Nevada in the other direction, and connect up to the Ely radar, which I guess is still there. We had C-band tracking radars, X-band tracking radars, syntheodolite, precision cameras, precision bombing range, and the rocket sled, which had just closed when I got there. Here's the runways at Edwards. The main runway is 15,000 feet. It's 300 feet wide. The secondary is 12,000 feet, 200 feet wide. There's a third runway. It's 800 feet. Plus, if we run off the end, there's another 10,000 feet of lake bed. And then on the lake bed, every year they would mark out the 39,000-foot lake bed runway and then the 22,000-foot runway. I will tell you, when everybody got called up to go do the annual runway fog walk, to walk a 15,000-foot by 300-foot runway sucks. Especially when there's not that many GIs on the base. The base was 90% run by civilians. There were 3 GIs in the whole place where I originally went to work at the telemetry station. What makes Edwards so good for testing is the lake bed. This lake bed is like a pool table in the summertime. It's dry, it's hard. It's an amazing, amazing place because the surface is so hard. In the winter, it can look like this. It'll actually get water. It could have 3-4 inches of water on the lake in the wintertime. When the lake is wet, they had this guy who'd been there since the 40s, Mr. Lakebed. You did not look at the lake bed until he said it was okay. You didn't touch it, drive on it, think about it, because they didn't want to run it up in the mud when the mud was still soft. So he decided it was okay to start using the lake bed again. The 2508 complex for you pilots. I'm sure if you float up this area, you've seen it on your charts, which is the restricted area for Edwards. Inside there are several other smaller restricted areas for Edwards itself, the bombing range, China Lake. But 2508 is the major restricted area. It is controlled by Edwards. So here's this handsome young feller at his first job at Edwards, and I was working at the telemetry station. We had 5, I guess, different control rooms at the telemetry station for flight tests. Most of the work I did was with civilian engineers from General Dynamics and McDonnell Douglas. We come in and we provide them their real-time, this is the real-time tracking, our data station. We also had FDS-16 tracking radars, C-band radars. There were 2 of them. They are 1 megawatt. They'll fry birds out of the sky. And each one has a 80-inch focal length TV camera. You'll notice I didn't say 80 millimeters, it's an 80-inch lens. You can really see out with these things. We also had a Nike Hercules, where they taken a Nike Hercules X-band radar and turned it into a data gathering radar. Really, really good tracking radar, skin tracking. It's only 500,000 watts, but it still worked really well. The C-band radars would track a transponder, which would increase their range and also made the data more accurate with a transponder type tracking. So here's the first project I was assigned to, F-111A, which was a horrible airplane. It should have been F-111H for horrible. 1968, we were still doing spin tests on F-111. And they were already starting to deploy F-111s out to the rest of the world. This airplane would get the most god-awful, horrible flat spins you ever saw in your entire life. It was, the airplane was flown by a pilot from General Dynamics, their test pilot. Several occasions I told him to eject and he didn't. And actually ended up recovering it and flying it away. You'll see the thing sticking out of the tail. It's a big giant parachute container. So if the airplane got into a spin and they finally couldn't get out of it, they deployed the parachute, drop the nose of the airplane, and start getting the air over the control surfaces, and the theory was you could fly it away. Also, you could restart the engines because these flat spins are so bad, the engines would typically flame out with no air through them. Never did see it crash. The father decided enough was enough already and that there was no good way to get it out of a flat spin, I think. And then we had the ejection capsule for the F-111A. 111 did not have ejection seats. The whole living room was ejected. Which on the face of it sounded like a really good idea. And it was a pretty comfortable airplane to fly in because you sat side by side instead of front and back. One of the 111s left one day, we were not tracking it, they were just off, I don't even know what they were doing, but they didn't come back. And we started looking for them, and the SAR Sky are looking for them. They found the airplane in a big pile of rubble up in the Sierra someplace. And there was the capsule not that far away, sitting on the ground, and both the crew were dead. They discovered after doing a bunch of tests, well, first they grounded every F-111 that there was, which happened about every 3 weeks. Grounded them all, started testing, they discovered that 50% of the capsules, the parachute door wouldn't open. Which is sort of interesting on a system that's supposed to be 99% effective. And they discovered that of the 50% that did open, 50% of those the parachute tore when it came out of the door. So this started a very long process of re-engineering and remanufacturing on the F-111 and sort of ended our spin project. We had F-4Es, which George Ron knows about F-4Es. There was a project called Tizio, which was a side-looking targeting radar. Did you have Tizio, right? I don't know if it ever even got deployed. We had these rows of trucks and tanks and personnel carriers out in the desert, and we would vector them up and down these rows of tanks and trucks, and then of course compare that picture data that they provided with known data. Pilots didn't like it because you got to fly down the track for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, then you had to turn around and come back to the track and fly down the track another 2 or 3 minutes, and turn around and come back again for about 2 hours. It was a crappy mission for the pilot. And then came the C-5. We prepared for the C-5 for a year because, number one, there was never an airplane that big. They built a hangar that you could drive one inside and close the door. They constructed a hydrant system for fueling because it took 7 fuel trucks to fill the thing. So they ran pipe down the hill from the fuel dump down onto the apron and built a hydrant system to fuel the C-5. All new instrumentation for the C-5, so digital instrumentation, where a lot of our instrumentation was all analog. And this picture is the number one airplane. You can see the probe sticking out in front of it. It was not a complete airplane. The nose did not open, but the tail did. It was totally empty inside, other than the flight deck. And then there was racks and racks of water tanks installed, so that we could fill these water tanks and we could change the CG and loading of the airplane by adding water to these water tanks. This to me is one of the funniest pictures of the C-5.
Look at the difference.
Refueling off of 135.
Good heavens.
I'm not so sure that they probably didn't burn as much fuel as they took in the amount of time they were connected to 135.
Yeah.
But it was always pretty funny watching making this picture. But the C-5 could refuel. And, the number 2 C-5 showed up. And the number 2 C-5, the project was 1,000 hours of flight time as soon as possible. Because nobody had any idea what the maintenance was going to be on these big new airplanes. Nobody had ever built an airplane this big, parts this big. They really didn't know. The engineers, are there any engineers here? Well, good, I'd have to apologize. We call the engineers the what-ifs. Because they walked in the hangar, the first words out of their mouth was usually, what if we tried this? But nobody knew. So the idea was this airplane had several hundred data points installed, and they would go up and fly 15, 16 hours, just boring holes in the sky, recording data, would come back, and post-flight the data for maybe 2 or 3 days. Engineers look over stuff. You go, oh, look at this. This thing right here has got a little vibration at about 300 hours, so we probably ought to change it out at 250 hours. And then that's truthfully how they developed the initial maintenance schedules on a lot of the parts on the airplane, which of course were modified over time and everything else, but that was the initial maintenance schedule. Soft field operations, which is sort of an interesting project. So we're testing all sorts of different things with the C5 and loading, and they would fly anywhere. They flew to Spokane via Tennessee one day because somewhere in Tennessee was having an air show, and actually gave them somewhere to go instead of just boring holes in the sky for 16 hours. So they went up to a lake up north of Edwards. I'm trying to remember the name of the dry lake. All right, the second. They didn't use the Edwards Lake for soft field testing. They want to see how soft the field would be to land C5. And they took a bunch of water trucks and they landed the airplane, and the engineers out there with their little measuring, they measured the tire indentations in the mud or the lake. They'd wet it down, they'd measure it again, they'd land again, they'd measure it, they'd land, and they kept getting it wetter and wetter. And of course the tire tracks are getting deeper and deeper. And the C5, you can decrease the tire pressure just like the C-130 for soft field landings. So finally they said, okay, this is it. Here's the number. This is as soft as it can be. And they had this number, which I don't even recall what the number was, but it was a softness number. Was that? So then one of the what-ifs said, well, we should now see how short it will stop with the soft field. Ooh, that sounds like a cool idea. So they took off, came around, put it down with full reverse thrust. The engines on a C5 are really big, and you have a lot of thrust, obviously. And they picked up nice big chunks of mud. And we're not talking this kind of chunks of mud, we're talking like this kind of chunks of mud. Threw it up in front of the intakes and took out two of the engines. So now here sits this airplane, I don't know, 60, 70 miles from the base, two bad engines on a mucky lake bed. And now they're going, like the Three Stooges, now what do we do? Now started a huge convoy of engine stands and mechanics and all the equipment needed to change out engines. They called the commanding officer in Barstow, and the Marines came out and laid down a bunch of Marston mat for them so they could actually work in the mud. And about 2.5 weeks later, they finally got the airplane out. The whole time, of course, the commanding officer of the C5 test project was having a cow because his airplane was stuck out in the mud. I worked on FB-111 nuclear weapons certification. That was a very odd project. We took a off-the-line FB, and the FB-111, which was designed for SAC as a bomber, was a modification of the normal FB-111A. It was a really good airplane, as a matter of fact. And we did every aircraft that carries nuclear weapons has to go through this certification process. So the guys in San Diego showed up with their mock-up weapons, with telemetry transmitters in them, and the way you turned on the telemetry was that you armed the weapon, which was a little disconcerting. As you're going down the checklist and you're turning on the nuclear consent switch, even though you know it's really not, it still makes you pucker a little bit. And they were really interested in vibration, and of course we never knew what they were worried about or what and how much, because that wasn't our problem, that was their problem. It was one of the reasons I started doing this. One of my kids one day said, so what'd you do in the Air Force, Dad? And I said, well, I did lots of stuff. Well, what kind of stuff? Well, I mean, a lot of stuff. And of course, those of you that were in the military, you know that when you get out, they tell you, you can't say anything about this, and this, and this, and this, and whatever they want you to say anything, get you have clearances for, whatever. But they never tell you when you can't say anything. So I said, well, I don't know. So I started this thing and looking at pictures, and this was an interesting project. F-11 or F-4 spins. The F-4 guys were having issues in Vietnam with flat spins. So the Navy, the Air Force, and McDonnell Douglas had a joint project to develop spin recovery techniques. And the airplane was flown by Major Jerry Gentry, who was the best pilot I ever flew with, and I flew with a lot of pilots. Gentry was amazing. He was one of these guys that he couldn't tell you how he did what he did. He just did it. So we had video cameras in the airplane, we had telemetry on the airplane, We wired the intercom to the telemetry so he could talk to us without having to key the mic switch. And it was pretty much decided that it was either going to project was going to be over in a crash. There you can see the spin chute tears off the back of the airplane.
Tears off the back of the airplane?
Yeah, we deployed the spin chute and just ripped off the back. And you can see that, you know, a lot of people think spins are like in the movies, and they're not. Very slow, very deliberate. And that was the end of the project. Major Gentry then spent the next, I think, 6 months touring F4 bases all over the world, lecturing on F4 spin recoveries with all the videos and all the information that we've gotten from this research. Amazing pilot. After this crash, we were putting all the telemetry away and radar data away. By this time, I was working in the Mission Control Center. We always classified anything that we had as soon as there was a crash. And it wasn't because it was secret necessarily, it was because that protected the data from being inadvertently tampered, destroyed, because it would be locked up. So we're locking up the data, we hear a helicopter out in the parking lot. And Gentry comes running in the door and he goes, "Pretty cool crash, guys, how was that? Show me the video, I want to see the tapes." Which of course we weren't supposed to show them the tapes, we were supposed to be locking them in the safe, but of course we did show them the tapes. But Gentry was an amazing pilot. We did FB-111 long-range navigation system testing. This airplane, and all of you remember when we tried to kill Gaddafi and we missed him. This is the airplane that we just missed him with.
Killed his mother, right?
And this is the same system that we just missed him with. It was an inertial platform. They took off and they flew for 15 hours and they came back and delivered weapons on the bomb range at Edwards. At 1,000 feet at Mach 1.4. It worked really good usually, except when it didn't. One afternoon we had 2 pilots that were SAC pilots. They weren't test pilots or members, they were SAC guys. And they came in and their nav system crapped out at about 14 hours. And they were tired after flying for 14 hours. And they came in and they called me on the radio and said, "Can we just go ahead and manually put the weapons on the bomb range?" I said, "Sure." So we would calculate the drop point and put it on. We use XY plotters that were 4 foot square. And I'm monitoring and they're reading me where they think they are, and I'm now counting down. We always use the same language when we drop things on the bomb range. Always, always, always the same words. And everybody that flew at Edwards knew the same words. And we briefed anybody that was not used to flying there on the words. So we also wired a tone generator on the radio for the people left, and to use that as a data marker. So when they deployed the weapons, it would go beep, and the cameras and the radars and the telemetry and everybody had a time hack now that they could sync the data with. So I give them the 60 seconds to release, I give them the 30 seconds to release, 15 seconds to release, 10 seconds to release, beep! Oh, this is not good. I grab my calipers and I go like this, and the weapons should have hit dead in the middle of Highway 395. Good part is they were iron bombs, there was no explosive in them. The bad part is they were going to land in the middle of 395. So I grabbed my boss and I said, The good part is they were just a skosh late on the button, and they landed about 150 feet inside the fence. So if you drive up Highway 395 and Highway 58, everything in that corner to the south and the west is the Edwards bomb range. So they were approaching from Barstow, basically. What we call the supersonic corridor. All the supersonic work was done across the desert from around Barstow and then over the range. And the bombs hit inside the fence. Now, of course, ends up the big debrief, and I'm standing there in my, see, at that time I probably had 4 stripes. And a bunch of a bunch of officers, including the base general, and we're talking, and so what happened? And my boss, who was the GS-13 said, well, you know, this is what happened. Can we hear the tape? Well, no, he said, so what happened? And this young officer, captain, pilot said, well, you know, we heard the release and we pickled the weapons. Okay, that's good. And then the general says to my boss, can we play the tape? And he said, well, sure. And I am clear as can be. And the general looked at these two young men and said, my office, 30 minutes. And we understood later that he sent them back to, I think they're from Kearney, Nebraska, Sac Base in Kearney, Nebraska. Sent them back on the bus. And they ferried another aircrew out to Edwards to take the airplane. So, AIM-9 heat seekers. AIM-9 heat seekers were having a problem with near misses. It was a really good missile, but they're having trouble with near misses. So one of the what-ifs said, well, what if we put a proximity switch in there? So that if it was a near miss, it would still go off. And we went, that sounds like a cool idea. So the guys from, I want to say Hughes, either Hughes or Raytheon, I forget who built this one. They show up with this missile and it's got a proximity fuse. They took the warhead out and put a telemetry pack in there so that we could monitor the data from the missile. Captain fluid, everything was good. The airplane went up to Hill Air Force Base to fly against the fire beam. They roll in on the fire beam, lock up on the fire beam, fire the missile. Looking at the data, you see the launch tone, and immediately after is the detonation tone in the warhead. Well, sort of odd. Well, the what-ifs had forgotten that the heat seeker would see the nose of the launching airplane. So if it would have been a live warhead, it would have taken the nose of the F-4 off. But they were making big money, and these were very highly skilled engineers, so they put the proximity switch in there, and then it worked really good. This is another what-if project, which is still in use today. The gunship, C-130 gunship, had a 30 millimeter cannon, it had a 40 millimeter Gulf cannon in it. And one of the what-ifs said, what if we put a 105 howitzer in there? I went, ooh, that sounds like a cool idea. So they rigged it up and we fired it on the range, and it is very cool. And the 105 gunships today still have the 105, which has to be just as scary as hell weapon if you're on the ground having somebody shoot 105 rounds down at you. It was bad enough with the miniguns. A7, and you say, here's the A7, and you see this little Cessna above it, and you wonder what the heck's the Cessna got to do with that A7? We had a gunnery range, and we were doing gun testing with the A7. And there was a wood tower where the controller would be in the radio. So I'm in the tower like this, and there's canvas targets like this. And they would come in and fire and go around, and they were usually, most times we'd have two airplanes doing this. So the controller would control them into fire, they'd pull out, go around. So I clear the A7 into fire, and he comes in, and he's about, and you see him go off like this. And I ask him on the radio, you have a problem? He says, look downrange, and here's a guy in a Cessna, I don't know, 150, 172, whatever it was, about 300 feet off the deck, right across the gunnery. If the A7 would have hit him, it would have been pieces of aluminum about this big. I'm sure it scared the crap out of him when the A7 pulled up next to him to get his tail number so he could call the FAA. Never heard what happened to the guy, and never knew what the heck he was doing in there in the first place. If this happened, not real often, but often enough, these guys would end up in a restricted area, and then, of course, this guy had to violate 2 restricted areas to get to where he was. And he just thought it was perfectly fine. Barriers. Most people don't know that a lot of Air Force bases have a barrier, have a cable at the end of the runway. Air Force F-4s have tailhooks. This is a picture of an F-111 engaging a cable with no landing gear. And it was pretty amazing because the airplanes had some damage, but the crew walked away unscathed from engaging the wire. And it's kind of hard to see this picture, and it works just like an aircraft carrier. We had a couple of different systems we were testing. One had big drums of glycol that were in pits in the ground. That didn't work that great because they went over speed and then the glycol would expand and boil and blow the bolts off and blow the lids off, these big bins of throw hot glycol all over the place. The earlier ones had like B-52 brakes, and you could adjust the brakes for whatever weight of airplane you were expecting. I don't know if they have oil barriers at Air Force bases or not. I don't know if our newest fighter airplanes have those. It would make any difference. Did for a long time. And we did lots of testing on the barriers. On November 27, 1970, a charter DC-8 en route to Vietnam runs off the end of Anchorage's new 10,000-foot runway, carrying troops to Vietnam. There were 48 killed and many, many injured. Senior Master Sergeant Ronald MAKINSON, who was my uncle, who was on his way for his second deployment in Vietnam, crawled off the airplane and then turned around and crawled back in and made several trips back and forth on the airplane, pulling out injured troops. And he was awarded the Airman's Medal, which is the highest award for non-combat for Air Force. So now there was a big initiative that, okay, this could happen at any civilian airport, so we need to be able to come up with a system to fix that. So here's this thing here. There's a French company designed, and it was the vertical lines are nylon cable or webbing about that wide, cable on the ground, cable overhead, the whole thing folded down into the runway. The idea was the pilot would mash a button in the cockpit if it was point of no return, and this whole thing would, like this. It was amazing to watch this thing erect itself. And then the airplane would, the nose would go through the straps, and we would stop the airplane with these straps along the leading edge of the wings. So they said, well, we should test this. And the guys in the FAA kind of liked the idea. So we took a non-flyable B-52. They mounted spoilers on the tops of the wings so it couldn't inadvertently try and fly. And we gauged this net system at 180 knots. And amazingly, it worked really good. The only damage to the airplane was dimples and dents in the front edges of the wings, but it stopped the airplane. We actually filled the fuel tanks of this B-52 long enough to make it heavier, not so they had this main airplane. So there's definitely an egg operation to make it the match that Grand Jet, World War I Navy. The problem with Grand Jet is the things in World War II, submarine sailor, all the big airplanes. I have an uncle who was an Air Force guy. 747 L2. Navy lived here in the 60s. Way too big. As a kid, you would not even think about going to the Navy. Completely Coast Guard you couldn't get into. Or drowning, you couldn't get into. I don't know if it ever went anywhere. I've never heard. I don't know. But that was the end of our testing because everybody said, well, what are we going to do now with these big airplanes? We also provided support for the Air Force Flight Test Pilot School. Test Pilot School was pretty amazing. They were always guys who were in their second enlistment. They were picked from the Air Force for their piloting skills. And it was a pretty intensive training for test pilots. And they had several airplanes. They used the T-33s for spin recovery testing. I always thought it was a little weird. My boss was a really nice guy, cool guy, and I was the only GI in the control center. So he said to me one day, you know, if you're going to be controlling these missions, you ought to go fly them so you know what you're doing. All the old guys that I was working with, they didn't want to fly. So, and we had requirement from time to time for somebody to fly in the chase airplane from the range. So off I went and did some spins in the T-33. Of course, the guy that was flying said, well, I don't know why we use this airplane because all you got to do is let go of everything and it'll pretty much recover itself. It's not that hard to recover a T-33 from a spin. They had a bunch of them. They had T-38s that they used for several different other training and test pilot school. We also used the T-38 for chase airplane quite a bit. For the guy sitting in the back seat, the T-38 was my favorite in the back seat because the view in the back of the T-38 is spectacular. big canopy and really see good from the back seat. They also had F-104s. Zoom project was they assigned you an angle of attack, you had weather data that we would give the pilot, and you had airplane data, and you were supposed to calculate how high the airplane would go. But it was also a pressure suit flying problem. So they would go out behind Barstow, come back towards Edwards at about 30,000 feet, Mach 1, 8 or 9, push down a little bit to even accelerate more, get it up to about 2-1. On the command, pulled up and you flew this angle of attack. Afterburner off at, I'm trying to remember the numbers now, I think it was about 62,000. Engine off at less than 80,000. Dead stick over the top. Down, relight, and land with no fuel for a go-around. They practiced dead stick basically, and throttles to idle for a couple months before they did the first one landing on the lake bed. Because the 104 is basically a rock with no power. Record for a 103 was 103,000 feet for a standard single seat F-104. And they would start at trying to like 20 degrees, and then I think the highest was about 45 degree angle of attack during their training. We also had the NF-104, astronaut trainer. The NF-104, the wings were 18 inches longer. They had hydrogen peroxide jets in the wingtips, and there was hydrogen peroxide jets in the nose. They put the 2-seat tail on it, which was a little bit bigger, and a rocket motor in the tail that burned hydrogen peroxide and jet fuel. And it would go 120,000 feet. And the idea was this was going to be an astronaut trainer and had a separate joystick just for the reaction controls. General Chuck Yeager put one of these in the desert one afternoon. They built 3 of them. 2 of them are still around, and they're on display in different places. This is a picture of one of our radar charts. And it's odd where I got this. This was laying on the desk, on the docent's desk back there, next to the P-26 in Manila envelope. Nobody ever said where it came from, it put his name on it. It was really weird, and I don't know where it came from, but so I blew it up and put it in this thing. So you can see the red line is the flight track, ground track of the airplane coming in from the east, and you can see it comes around, makes the loop and lands, and you can see here, you can see in the blue line there's the apex of the zoom flight. So this one went, and this was the NF-104. This went 108,000 feet. And what's odd is this was a mission when I worked there. The controller's name here is Marvin. He was one of our civilian controllers. This was the only mission that we had 2 radar controllers on the mission. One that would have this map, and another one that had a map of angle of attack. Because we tracked angle of attack, it was really important that as the speed dropped off, that the angle of attack didn't get too steep, because you could come down backwards. And coming down backwards could be catastrophic. So here's the data panel. So this is supposed to be 39 degrees on the NF-104. Here's a picture of the back of the 104 with, at that time, Colonel Yeager working on the, posing with the engine. He was commandant of the test pilot school at one point. I did a lot of things with the 6593rd Test Squad. Where is Chuck? I see Chuck coming in. There he is. Chuck knows this very well. Those of you who were here a while back saw Chuck's presentation about this project. which was a satellite film package recoveries for Discovery or Corona, except we couldn't say Corona, so we called it Discovery. We couldn't use the word Corona. If you say Corona anywhere around Ron Pincher, he still goes into a stroke mode. And we were testing parachutes. Chuck was over in Hawaii doing the actual work. We were testing parachutes. We were testing grappling hooks. You ever kind of grappling hooks in this program? So here's just a quick picture of the Corona or Discovery satellite, whatever you want to call it. And 2 film canisters. Here's a picture of one of the canisters. Here's one of the calibration targets. These are sort of interesting. You can still find these in some places. They poured these concrete calibration targets, usually out in the desert. They were surveyed in, they knew exactly what size they were. So you could take a picture of this, and then from this you could calibrate the data that you took of what you were really trying to take a picture of. Then they came out with a hexagon satellite. They decided the Corona wasn't big enough. This one had 4 much larger satellite. But we caught a lot of stuff. We throw it out, go up to 25,000 feet, throw it out the back of one airplane, then go down and snatch it up with another one. But here's the hexagon. Here's one of the C-130s picking up one of the film packs. Used the system, went out the back of the airplane and grabbed them out of the sky. And again, Chuck was over in Hawaii doing this for real. Here's a 15,000-pound film pack, satellite or whatever it was supposed to be. This one was different in that it had that dome on the top, and we engaged that dome with the hooks instead of the main parachute. And it was supposedly stronger, had bigger straps, and it was stronger when we grabbed it and it wouldn't tear through. Plus, somebody had the vision that if it did tear through, that the main chute would reopen and the package might safely soft land in the ocean, and maybe they could find it. We were still doing work with the U-2. This is one of my favorite pictures of this particular individual. This is Kelly Johnson standing here next to his U-2. But does anybody see anything that looks odd with this U-2?
The tip?
Look at the tail numbers.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Civilian tail numbers. This was not an Air Force airplane. This is a CIA airplane. And had civilian tail numbers, which I always thought was pretty funny. The Air Force U-2s had red tail numbers that were about this big. And we had the good old SR-71 and YF-12s. Still doing testing on those at that time. This is the only decent picture you can find of one on the ground, and it's always odd to me to see these because our airplane did not have all these white markings. The airplanes just had red tail numbers, little small red tail numbers, and didn't have the skunk on the tail or any of this other stuff. But we're still testing YF-12. They still hadn't given up the idea of making the SR-71 a fighter airplane. So let's see if this will work. This is
In June of 1971, when flying a regular mission at Edwards, I suddenly got it had an engine explosion followed by a fire warning light. But that's not too bad. It's 34 miles away. And Gargle 18021 That's how I have to make a right turn to come out of the fire to keep this speed up on the good edge. You can see the fire coming out the right engine. As the film progresses, you'll notice the fire gets bigger and bigger.
This was taken with one of those 80-inch focal length TV cameras on the center of our tracking radar.
When you see the ejection, you'll see the backseat radar operator go out first, and then followed approximately 3 or 4 seconds later by myself. see the ejection sequence, we have an actual rocket motors underneath the seats that propel us out of the airplane. Passed through his knee.
Attention all aircraft in the Edwards area. The aircraft YF-12. The crew has ejected from the aircraft. The aircraft is on the east lakeshore at this time in a right turn.
It was a sick feeling watching that beautiful airplane go crashing into the earth like an atom bomb.
You see the white X painted on the bottom of the airplane
Yeah.
for photography?
Glad I wasn't still in it. This young fellow on my left is Major Billy Curtis, who's my radar operator in the back seat. We landed in our parachutes not far from out of the 58 we were all right. I had scooped up a mouthful of sand while being drugged by the parachute, but otherwise I felt reasonably well. That night, however, I already felt the effects of the landing impact. I clutched the wall and hung on to the door handles trying to make it down the hallway to the bedroom. In the morning, I didn't really expect to be able to get out of bed. I figured I'd be so stiff I couldn't walk, but actually, I felt much better. Right after the bailout, they took me into the hospital for a quick check-over. While I was there being checked, I got a commander from General Bob White of X-15 fame telling me that he just received word from ADC headquarters and had been promoted to full colonel. He said, I wasn't supposed to tell you this till tomorrow, but just so you'll feel better about the loss of that airplane, I'm telling you now.
So that, if you heard support radar, that was me. They called in, the tower called us saying we have an airplane that thinks they're on fire. You can't see out of the back of this A-12, YF-12. It's got a little periscope thing. This doesn't work very well. So can you guys bring the radar up and see if we can find him and tell him they're on fire, which I did, and which we did. He punched out. He was trying to make it back to the lake bed. The hydraulics had failed by that time.
Good stuff.
So then came the FAA certification that I was talking about earlier. 747 showed up with their big list of things that they had to do to be certified to carry passengers by the FAA. All sorts of weird stuff, most of which we didn't get involved with very much other than finding a place to do it. Things like early rotation takeoffs, they bolted a big plank of wood underneath the tail and they dragged the tail down. Missing engine aborted landings, called back one engine, 3 engine landings, and a whole list of stuff that the FAA required. We were doing the same thing with the L-1011 right around the same time. They all showed up at the same time. And the DC-10. We also did a FAA certification for a Super Guppy, NASA Super Guppy. They had repowered this thing with turboprops, where the original airplane had reciprocating engines. And this is one of the examples of, we won the Air Force Flight Safety Award 2 years in a row at Edwards when I was there. And everybody said, how in the world can you guys do that? You're flying all these airplanes that are testing and not proven. And the reason we did is that our pilots would bring airplanes back that a line pilot wouldn't. A line pilot would dump it. A test pilot brings it back so you can see what actually broke. Because contrary to the movies, trying to piece it together in the hangar in little pieces to find out what broke is not like they say it is in the movies. But when we did have crashes, unfortunately they were bad. So here's that same Guppy. They were doing their 3-engine aborted takeoffs. There was the pilot, co-pilot, and the FAA observer. The touchdown powered up to take off, and the engine on the wing that had the no power, the engine flamed out. And the airplane just did like a pirouette or whatever, and a somersault, crashed straight dead on the nose. Of course, killing all three of the crew. Terrible crash. We had great pictures of it. We had videotaped the crash because one of our radars had broken down, and the radar guys had just fixed it. They called me and they said, "Can we try the radar?" And I said, "Sure." And I had been working on a video recorder. And I said, "Good, that's good. I need to check the video recorder too. Let's find a target down on the flight line somewhere." Well, these guys were flying around. Could you find a better radar target than this big giant silver thing? So we actually had videotape of the crash, which the FAA was amazed that we did. It was sheer blind luck that we did because under normal circumstances there wouldn't have been any pictures. We also supported NASA. NASA had their own radars, they had their own control center, but we were always the backup for NASA. This is the NASA hangar. And they were flying all kinds of crazy stuff. The craziest was these things, the lifting bodies. They were supposed to be what the space shuttle was going to look like. There was 3 different versions here. They were like a flying brick. The glide ratio was non-existent. And so here's the M2, F2, which is one of the earlier ones. You've seen pictures of this one flying, probably, because if you watch the $6 Million Man, this is the airplane that crashes in the beginning of the $6 Million Man. And those pictures, again, were taken by one of the tracking radars with the big lens on the landing. The crash was caused because he was worried about a photography helicopter that was in the area, and he thought the guy was in the way, and the controller kept telling him he wasn't in the way, but he got worried about it and didn't get the landing gear out in time. Because on this thing, as soon as the gear came out there, what little lift there was totally gone. And he landed gear up. And you know how if you slide something across the table, it'll slide like this, but as soon as it hits some little irregularity, it'll kind of turn sideways. Well, that's what happened to this, and then it rolled 3 miles across the desert. And that's what it looked like when it was done. So NASA decided, well, we can't waste this good airplane, so they rebuilt it. And it now became the M2F3. People look at this and go, there's no way that crashed up airplane flew again. Well, it did. It's right there. And they added a third fin, because that was one of the problems that the pilot had complained about was yaw stability, just the 2 tail fins. So they added a third one. Then there was the X-24A, which was a real goofy looking thing. Then there was the X-24B. How they named all these, I don't know. Somebody decided it was a cool way to name them. But all 3 of these were dead dropped off of B-52. They had a rocket motor in them to get more altitude, and then they would dead stick land on the lake bed. Here's the HL-10, and you can see, I probably can't read the numbers, but this thing was not big. It was a little tiny airplane. And it's almost bad to call it an airplane because it almost wasn't. I worked on the last flight of the X-15. We were just wrapping up X-15 when I was there. And amazing airplane. Most people still don't have any idea of the things that the X-15 did and the records and how old it was. This was not something that happened in 1990. And then they put extra tanks on it trying to get more altitude so they carried more fuel. So the record was 353,000 feet with the X-15 at 20 miles per hour.
That's hypersonic, right?
They put this ablative coating on it, thinking that would help it go faster and higher. But the last day that it flew the X-15 was kind of sad. Everybody was sorry to see it go, and they flew it, landed it, and then 2 days later it was loaded up on the B-52 and taken to the Smithsonian. B-70, worked on the last flight of this airplane as well. They built 2 B-70s, one of which crashed in a highly publicized photography adventure. every time they flew, they had to repaint it with paint off a lot of surfaces. Unfortunately, the B-70 crashed while at a photo op for General Electric. They had a bunch of GE engine airplanes around it, and the 104 got in too close. And for those of you that are flying airplanes close to other airplanes, you know that you never want to approach another airplane from above the wing. You're going to approach the other airplane in close, you want to approach them down below where the air is relatively smooth. This thing kind of faked you out because with the wingtips tipped down, that bad air was this way also, not just up. And the 104 got in that wingtip air and rolled across the tails and took two tails off.
That was Walker. He was an
The
X-15
existing
pilot.
B-70 is in the Museum of the Air Force in Dayton, one only one slide. Space shuttle, wind studies. We launched these balloons every day for the 4 years or 3.5 years I was there. Every day we launched this balloon. It's full of hydrogen, which the weather balloon guys really hated because it wasn't helium. We tracked it to 65,000 feet. We tracked the wind speed, wind direction every single day. And we were supposed to be developing wind patterns for the space shuttle. And you know what we discovered? There was no pattern. Every day was different, every month was different. One May was different from the other May. I don't know where these things came down. They had a valve in them and they would expel gas because they were launched full, tight. And they had aluminum shavings in there, so they were great radar. And it would go to about 65,000 and it would just go. Pretty soon it just disappeared. We couldn't track it anymore. I don't know where they ended up. I always thought there was probably some farmer in Kansas somewhere. They see him landing at his farm and he was figured he was being invaded by aliens or something. Because of course there was no markings on it saying return to NASA or any other nifty thing. It was just a thing. The big airplanes caused another issue, which was wake turbulence. Again, nobody had any idea. I mean, they did, but they didn't have any idea what the wake turbulence was going to be like off these big airplanes, from C5 down to the big airliners. So we set up our radar and we vectored in every kind of airplane you could imagine, from Cessna 150s to airliners to everything you could imagine. Different offsets, back, side to side, up and down. According to data, to see how far back these airplanes were affected by the wake turbulence. One of the worst ones I saw early on was the C5. This guy in F4 came in and 14 miles back hit the wake turbulence off the C5, rolled over and fell 14